The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out, their deep tone reverberating across Rome as Sister Clara knelt quietly in the garden, tending to the flowers. Unnoticed, unseen, she was just another nun, another humble servant of the Vatican. But then a summons from the Pope himself. The room where he lay, frail and weakened, was dimly lit as he beckoned Clara to his side. With trembling hands, he handed her a simple envelope, telling her to open it only when the sun rises. What did it contain? A final message? A secret that would forever change her life? As the night deepened and the Pope's breaths grew slower, the world outside moved on, unaware of the quiet bond being formed. But inside that room a quiet promise was made, one that no one could ever see coming. What was in the letter, and why did the Pope choose her? If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. In the early hours of a cool spring morning, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out with a deep, mournful tone that echoed over the rooftops of Rome. The sound seemed to stretch across the city, filling the air with a heavy, almost sacred presence. The bells tolled not for a celebration, but for a man who was preparing to leave this world, the Pope. Inside the Vatican, everything moved more slowly, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. The marble floors gleamed beneath the faint light that filtered in through the high windows, casting long shadows in the quiet hallways. In the midst of all this solemnity, a small, unassuming figure moved quietly through the gardens of the Vatican, her hands brushing lightly against the delicate petals of the flowers. Sister Clara was a woman who often went unnoticed, her presence blending seamlessly with the calm, timeless atmosphere of the place. She was not from a noble lineage, nor was she trained in the old revered European monasteries. Her origins were much humbler, coming from a small, sun-drenched village in the heart of Mexico. Sister Clara had grown up in a place where the land was dry and cracked, where the sun beat down relentlessly on the earth, and where the sound of prayer rose from simple chapels made of mud and stone. There were no bells there to mark the time, only the steady rhythm of life, shaped by the seasons and the needs of the people. Clara had been raised by her grandmother, a woman whose voice was rich with the hymns of the church. The days were long and filled with laughter, the sound of children running barefoot through dusty fields, and the quiet hum of life in a place that few would ever visit. When tragedy struck, taking both her parents in quick succession, it was the Sisters of Charity who took her in. They offered her a home, a place to find peace and a new life. She moved far from the heat of her village to the cool marble halls of the Vatican, where the air was thick with history, and where people from all over the world came to witness the grandeur of the church. But for Sister Clara, the Vatican was not a place of fame or recognition. It was simply home, a place where she continued her work in quiet devotion. Her life in the Vatican was simple. She worked in the gardens, carefully tending to the plants that bloomed throughout the grounds. She cooked for the elderly priests who had long since retired from the public eye, and she nursed them as they reached the final days of their lives. She polished brass doorknobs until they gleamed, ensuring that every corner of the Vatican was spotless. But despite her tireless work, no one seemed to notice her. She was just another nun in a sea of faces, fading into the background. There were no grand titles for Sister Clara, no invitations to the banquets where the important figures of the church gathered. She was content with this, content to serve in silence, away from the spotlight. And yet, on one ordinary afternoon, something changed. Sister Clara had entered a large, somber conference room carrying a tray of tea for the cardinals and dignitaries gathered there. She moved quietly, hoping to leave without anyone noticing her presence. It was a routine she had followed countless times before, but as she was about to slip out the door, she felt a gaze upon her. She froze, looking up to see the Pope himself, Pope Benedict, seated at the far end of the long table. His eyes, though tired, were kind, and he gave her a small, genuine smile. It was not the polite smile he often offered to the public, but a real, unguarded smile, a smile that reached the corners of his eyes. "Stay a moment, sister," he called gently. Startled, Clara hesitated at the door. She had never been asked to stay, let alone speak with someone of the Pope's stature, but the warmth in his voice made her feel welcome, as if she were more than just a servant in the background. Slowly, she stepped forward and placed the tray on the table. The cardinals and other church officials smiled politely, but it was clear that they did not fully understand the significance of this simple request. From that day on, things changed. The Pope began to ask for her presence during his quieter moments. Sometimes he would ask her to join him in the garden, where he would feed the birds, or he would ask her to read letters from missions in distant countries. The conversations were never about politics or church affairs. They were simple, personal exchanges. They spoke about her childhood, the mango trees in her village, the songs her grandmother had sung to her during storms. He listened, not for advice but for companionship. It was clear that the Pope, despite his position as the leader of the church, found solace in the company of someone who had no interest in power or recognition. To Clara, this was a gift, an opportunity to share a part of herself with a man who, like her, knew the value of humility. She was no longer the unnoticed sister in the background. She had become someone the Pope valued, someone whose quiet strength and unwavering devotion had captured his attention. Clara began to understand that sometimes, the most important connections are not the ones made in grand ceremonies or public displays, but in the quiet moments of shared humanity. As the days passed and the Pope's health began to decline, Clara's role in his life became even more significant. She no longer simply cared for the garden or the elderly priests. She became a source of comfort, offering him peace in a world that was becoming increasingly uncertain. The bond between them, once forged by simple moments of shared conversation, now grew stronger with each passing day. She had become a silent witness to the Pope's final years, a constant presence in a time of great change. Sister Clara had always lived in the background, unseen and unnoticed by most. But now, she was a quiet but vital part of the Vatican's story, a story that was unfolding in ways she never could have imagined. As the days drifted into months, Sister Clara's life took on a new rhythm. The usual hum of routine, the clink of dishes, the soft rustle of prayer beads, the steady steps of her feet on the marble floors, began to feel like something more. There was an unspoken connection between her and Pope Benedict, one that neither had expected but which had quietly grown into something precious. It was a connection that did not demand anything of her but simply asked her to be present, to remain steady and kind, even in the most fleeting of moments. The world outside the Vatican remained ever bustling, full of grand speeches, foreign dignitaries, and important church affairs. Yet inside the Vatican walls, amidst the delicate fragrances of the blooming flowers and the rustling of papers in quiet corridors, Sister Clara found herself becoming an unlikely source of comfort for the Pope. It was not her wisdom that he sought. It was her silence, her presence, and her genuine kindness. She had no agenda, no aspirations, no desire for recognition. She was simply there, always ready to listen, to help, to serve without expectation. It became clear to Clara that the Pope, despite his high position and responsibilities, shared something of her quiet loneliness. As he grew weaker with each passing day, he increasingly sought her company, though there were no grand speeches or public declarations. His requests were simple. Would she sit with him for a while, read a letter, or accompany him for a brief walk in the garden? The time they spent together was always unhurried, and it felt more like the gathering of old friends than the meeting of one of the world's most powerful men with a humble servant. Pope Benedict's health had begun to decline significantly, but his spirit, it seemed, had grown brighter. There was something deeply human about the moments they shared. The trivial matters that filled most days, politics, formalities, diplomacy, faded into the background when Clara was around. All that mattered was the quiet, comforting companionship she offered. Clara's days were filled with small acts of service. She helped in the garden, cooked meals for the elderly priests, and ran errands for those in need. She never expected anything in return. Her only wish was to serve where she was needed with humility and grace. But now, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that filled her heart with a quiet joy. There were times when the Pope would ask her to sit beside him in the garden or simply to be there as he read aloud from a letter he had received. She would listen intently, not for the content of the words but for the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability that had once been hidden behind the great walls of the church. As their conversations deepened, Clara began to realize that the Pope, in his own way, had come to see her as more than just a servant. There were no grand titles exchanged between them, no formal speeches. He didn't call her Sister Clara, as most others did. Instead, he would simply address her as Clara, as though they were equals, united in their shared humanity. It was in these moments that Clara felt the weight of the Pope's true thoughts. He would share stories of his youth, of the struggles and sacrifices he had made to follow his calling. In return, Clara shared stories of her humble beginnings, of her grandmother's faith, of the songs that had kept her grounded in moments of despair, and of the beauty she had once known in the arid fields of her childhood. The more they spoke, the more Clara began to realize that the Pope, despite his elevated position in the world, was like any other person. He had known loss, heartache, and the quiet struggle of seeking purpose. She understood that the Pope had once been a man much like her, living a simple life before stepping into the world's spotlight. Now, as his health deteriorated, he seemed to crave the simplicity and authenticity of the life he had once known. In Clara, he found a reflection of that simple life, one that was not clouded by expectations or the burdens of power. Even as the world outside buzzed with preparations for the Pope's next public appearance or speech, Clara was content with the simplicity of their time together. There were no cameras or reporters to capture the fleeting moments they shared. There were no grand ceremonies, no applause. It was just Clara and Pope Benedict, sitting in silence beneath the cool shade of the garden's ancient trees, watching. The birds flit about, feeding on crumbs from the bread he had once shared with his visitors. Their conversations were filled with everyday thoughts, like the way the wind would rustle through the leaves, or the way the sun would set over the hills. Outside the Vatican, these small, quiet moments spoke volumes about the relationship they had built, a relationship that did not rely on words or grand gestures, but on an unspoken bond of trust and mutual respect. Though many of the Vatican staff began to whisper about the closeness between the Pope and the humble nun, neither Clara nor Pope Benedict ever spoke of it. Their connection, though special, remained private, an intimate part of their lives that was not meant to be shared with the world. But as the Pope's health began to fail further, Clara's role in his life became more essential. She was not only a caretaker but a companion, a friend, and someone who brought light into his increasingly dark world. The simple act of being present, of sharing small everyday moments, seemed to offer the Pope a sense of peace that no grand speech or public appearance ever could. Clara had become, without knowing it, a light in his life, someone who reminded him of the world outside the Vatican, of the simple beauty of life, of the kindness that existed in the hearts of ordinary people, of the deep faith that could be found not in grand displays, but in quiet, unseen acts of love. As the days passed, Clara began to realize that the time they had together was precious, and that her presence, though unnoticed by many, had become one of the most significant parts of Pope Benedict's final years. In the silence of the garden, she found a deep connection with the Pope that transcended all of the formalities and titles that normally defined their world. And in those quiet moments, she understood that sometimes the simplest acts of love and care are the ones that matter the most. The days grew shorter, and the air in the Vatican seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and untold emotions. Pope Benedict's health had deteriorated rapidly, and with each passing day, the vibrancy that once filled the grand halls of the Vatican seemed to fade. The cardinals, once busy with their duties, moved in hushed tones, their faces grim. Yet amidst the solemnity, Sister Clara continued her quiet service. She tended the garden, polished the sacred vessels, and prepared meals for the elderly priests, her work unbroken by the heaviness of the days around her. As the autumn months began to roll in, the winds carried a chill that seemed to match the deepening quiet within the Pope's chambers. But despite his frailty, the Pope's requests remained simple. He did not call for the grand gestures or public speeches that marked his role as the leader of the church. Instead, he called for Sister Clara, his quiet companion, the one person whose presence seemed to bring him peace. And so, with each day that passed, Clara became more entwined in his final days, a silent witness to the Pope's journey toward the end. It was on a crisp evening, when the air smelled of rain and fading roses, that Sister Clara was summoned again. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in deep shadows. Clara stood in the garden, brushing dirt from her hands as she worked with the plants. The peaceful solitude of the garden had become a balm to her soul, a momentary escape from the weight of her duties. But that evening, the quiet was broken by the soft, hurried footsteps of one of the Vatican staff. The man, his face strained with a look of concern, approached her. "Sister Clara," he said, his voice tight. "His Holiness is asking for you." Clara nodded, her heart skipping a beat. She had become accustomed to the Pope's calls, but there was something in the staff member's voice that hinted at something more serious. She hurried after him, her footsteps quickening as they moved through the narrow halls of the Vatican. The dim light of the evening flickered softly in the corridors, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Finally, they reached the Pope's private chambers. The room was dark, the thick drapes drawn tightly to keep out the light. The only illumination came from a small lamp on the bedside table, its soft glow casting a holy warmth over the scene. Pope Benedict lay in bed, propped up by pillows. His white robes looked fragile against the darkened room, his frame appearing smaller, more fragile than ever. His rosary was loosely wrapped around one of his hands, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Despite the obvious toll that illness had taken on him, when Clara entered the room, he opened his eyes, and a faint, tender smile spread across his face. "Clara," he whispered, his voice weak but warm. "Come closer." Clara knelt beside the bed, her heart heavy with the sadness she could no longer hide. The Pope's smile, despite his suffering, was genuine, filled with a love that transcended words. He reached out with his trembling hand, pulling a small plain envelope from beneath the covers. His handwriting was shaky but deliberate, each stroke carefully crafted, as though he had poured his final strength into the act. He held the envelope out to her. "For you," he said softly, his voice cracking. "Open it tomorrow, after the sun rises, in the garden. Alone." Clara took the envelope, her hands trembling as she held it. She could feel the weight of it, the significance in the simple act of giving it. She pressed the envelope to her chest, nodding silently. "I will," she whispered, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. The Pope smiled faintly, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "You have a heart, like Mary's," he said, his words barely audible, quiet and fierce enough to carry the world. Clara didn't know how to respond to that. She simply bowed her head, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. She pressed the envelope close to her chest, as though it held not just a letter, but a part of the Pope's soul. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice weaker now. And so Clara stayed. She sat by his side, holding his hand through the long, quiet hours of the night. The minutes stretched into hours, the clock ticking slowly in the background as the Pope's breathing grew shallower. Clara hummed the familiar hymns that her grandmother had sung to her as a child, soft, comforting melodies that had always filled her heart with peace. The sound of her voice was the only thing that filled the room, the only thing that seemed to ease the tension in the air. No one came to visit during those hours. The cardinals, the bishops, the staff, all were absent. It was just Sister Clara and the Pope in that quiet room, alone together in the final moments of his life. The night deepened. The ancient clock in the hall struck midnight, then 1, then 2. The Pope's breathing grew slower, the rise and fall of his chest becoming weaker with each passing moment. Clara stayed by his side, her hand wrapped around his, offering him what comfort she could in the final hours of his life. And then, just as the first light of dawn touched the edges of the horizon. Pope Benedict exhaled his final breath. There was no struggle, no fear, just a quiet exhale, as if his soul had slipped away like a whisper carried on the morning breeze. Clara remained by his side, holding his hand until the very end, her heart breaking but filled with a deep sense of peace. She had been with him just as he had asked, and now, with his passing, she understood the depth of his request. He had asked for her presence, for her simple companionship, and in that moment, as the first light of day broke through the window, Clara felt the weight of the love that had passed between them. Sister Clara stayed by the Pope's side, honoring the final request he had made of her. The world outside would soon stir with grief, but inside that quiet room, the bond between Clara and the Pope remained unbroken. The morning after Pope Benedict's passing was filled with a sense of deep sorrow, the kind that seemed to seep into the very air of the Vatican. The bells tolled once again, louder now, as the world outside stirred in grief, the echoes of their tolls reaching far beyond the Vatican's walls, spreading throughout Rome and the corners of the world. The staff gathered in the courtyard, their faces somber as they whispered prayers preparing for the coming funeral. Flags hung at half-mast, their bright colors muted in the early morning sun. Yet, amidst the outward mourning, Sister Clara was alone in the Vatican garden, standing beneath the shade of an old fig tree. Her hands trembled as she sat in silence, the small, simple envelope still clutched in her palm. It had been a quiet, lonely night in that dimly lit room where the Pope had passed. But now, as the world continued its heavy march forward, she was left with a letter that had been carefully placed in her hands by the Pope, a letter that would carry his final words, his final thoughts, and his last gift to her. She pressed the envelope against her chest, her heart racing. There was an unspoken weight in the air as she sat alone in the garden, the sounds of the morning bells still ringing faintly in the background. The envelope, though plain and simple, felt heavier than any object she had ever held before. It was the last connection to a man she had come to love and respect, not for his power or position, but for the quiet moments they had shared, for the way he had seen her when no one else had. With a deep breath, Clara slowly peeled open the envelope. Her hands were shaky, and she took care not to tear the fragile paper inside. As she unfolded it, she found no grand titles, no formalities, just a simple message, written in the Pope's familiar, shaky handwriting. It was as though his final moments had been spent thinking of her, preparing these words for her alone. His thoughts, filled with gratitude, love, and humility, flowed across the page in a way that only he could convey. The letter read, "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I have already gone to the arms of our Father. Do not mourn me for too long, child. I have lived a life beyond what I deserved. I leave this earth with no riches, no crowns, only gratitude. Gratitude for so many things. Gratitude for the sparrows that sang in the Vatican gardens, for the children who smiled at me without knowing titles, and for the way the gospel sounds sweeter in humble tongues. But above all, my gratitude lies with you. You remind me, my dear Clara, of what the Church must never forget, that the kingdom of God is not built with marble or power, but with service given in silence, with love that expects no recognition. Have watched you, dear daughter. I have seen how you tend the gardens without being asked, how you care for the elderly priests without expectation, and how you pray when you think no one is looking. You have a gift, not of grand speeches or high offices, but of presence. Your ministry is found in every smile, every hand you hold, and every dish you wash. You preach a gospel louder than 1,000 homilies. So I entrust you with my final hope. Continue loving the unnoticed. Continue lifting those no one else bothers to see. Continue planting gardens where others see only stones. In my private desk there is a small box. Inside you will find a ring, not my papal ring, but a simple iron band I wore before the world knew my name. I leave it to you. Wear it not as a relic, but as a reminder that greatness is not found in golden crowns, but in soil-stained hands and humble hearts. You are more important to the future of the Church than 100 grand councils. Never doubt your worth. May the fig tree grow stronger every year you are near it. With my blessing, Francisca's tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she read his final words. It was as though the Pope, even in his last moments, had somehow known the depths of her heart, had understood the quiet strength that she had always carried even when no one else could see it. The Pope had seen her not for her position, not for the tasks she performed, but for who she truly was. Someone who gave love and care freely, without the need for recognition. The letter, though simple in its words, was filled with more power than any crown or title could ever hold. The Pope had given her more than just a letter. He had given her a message that would change the course of her life. It was a reminder that the true strength of the Church lay not in its grand buildings or ceremonies, but in the quiet, everyday, acts of love and service that went unnoticed by the world. Clara carefully folded the letter and pressed it to her chest once again, the warmth of the Pope's words filling her heart. As she sat beneath the fig tree, she felt a deep sense of peace. The letter had not only given her a sense of purpose, but had also opened her eyes to the truth that she had always known in her heart. The quiet work of service, the love that was given without expectation, was what truly mattered. And then, as if to complete the moment, Clara looked down at the letter again and noticed the small box the Pope had mentioned. It was tucked into the folds of the envelope, simple and plain. She opened it carefully, revealing an iron ring, weathered and worn with time. It was not grand, nor was it precious, but it felt like the most important thing she had ever held in her life. The ring was a symbol, not of power or authority, but of humility, of service, and of the love that the Pope had always carried in his heart. Clara slid the ring onto her finger, feeling its weight settle comfortably against her skin. It was a symbol of the Pope's legacy, and now it was her responsibility to carry it forward. She would continue to serve, to love, and to plant gardens where others saw only stones. She would continue the Pope's work, just as he had asked. With the ring on her finger and the letter in her heart, Clara stood up from beneath the fig tree, looking out at the garden that had been the Pope's sanctuary in his final days. She whispered a quiet promise to the world, to herself and to the memory of Pope Benedict. I will love them. I will lift them. I will plant gardens where others see only stones. And as the sun began to rise, Clara walked back to the quiet, humble life she had always known. She was no longer just a servant in the background. She was the living embodiment of the Pope's message, an enduring reminder that the greatest acts of love and service are often the ones that go unseen by the world.